Sometimes the smallest voice tells the biggest truth. Those words did not mean anything to me until the afternoon my 6-year-old daughter changed 3 lives with a single sentence. The silence inside the Romano estate was so perfect that I could hear the soft clicking of my worn shoes against the polished marble floor. Every crystal chandelier reflected warm afternoon sunlight across walls lined with priceless paintings, and the scent of fresh white roses drifted through the grand entrance as staff hurried to prepare for the annual charity gala. My name is Claire Foster, and at 28 years old, I had learned how to become invisible. That was the first lesson every maid working in a mansion like this discovered. Do your job well enough to be appreciated, but quietly enough to be forgotten. Usually, that was exactly how I preferred it. Life had taught me that invisible people attracted fewer questions. Normally, my daughter Emma stayed with my elderly neighbor while I worked long shifts, but Mrs. Wilson had called that morning with a severe case of the flu. I could not afford to miss work, and I certainly could not afford another babysitter. So after explaining my situation to the housekeeping manager, I received reluctant permission to bring Emma with me for the day. She promised to stay close, carrying her small coloring book everywhere she went, smiling at everyone with the kind of innocent kindness that made strangers smile back without realizing why. She had soft blonde hair that escaped every ponytail within minutes, bright blue eyes filled with endless curiosity, and the gentle habit of asking questions about everything she saw. I spent the afternoon dusting antique furniture, polishing silver railings, and helping arrange floral displays while Emma sat quietly near the library window, coloring little houses beneath bright yellow suns. Every so often she looked outside at the endless gardens stretching beyond the estate, whispering stories to herself that only children could understand. Around 5 o'clock the mansion transformed into organized perfection. Caterers rolled elegant serving carts through wide hallways. Musicians tuned their instruments inside the ballroom. Security personnel quietly checked every entrance while luxury cars began arriving one after another along the circular driveway. The staff straightened their uniforms almost instinctively because everyone knew the owner would arrive before the first guests entered. I had never spoken to Ethan Brooks. In truth, very few employees ever did. Stories about the Mafia Boss traveled through whispered conversations in break rooms and kitchens, describing a man who rarely smiled, spoke softly, and somehow commanded an entire room without raising his voice. Some people feared him, others respected him. I simply stayed out of his way. Emma tugged gently on my sleeve as we crossed the entrance hall, carrying fresh flower arrangements toward the ballroom. "Mommy," she whispered, "is this the man who owns the big house?" Before I could answer, the enormous front doors opened. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor as several security professionals entered first, scanning the room with practiced calm before stepping aside. Then Ethan Brooks walked inside wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair neatly combed back, his blue eyes calm and unreadable, his presence somehow making the magnificent mansion feel quieter than before. Every employee lowered their eyes. Every conversation stopped. Every movement slowed. I did the same, gently guiding Emma closer to my side. But she did not lower her eyes. Instead, she stared directly at him with quiet wonder, slipped her small hand from mine, pointed across the grand entrance, and said with complete certainty, "That is my father." The words echoed through the entrance hall long after Emma stopped speaking. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it as childish imagination. Even the musicians rehearsing inside the ballroom seemed to fade into silence. I felt every pair of eyes settle on me, and for one terrifying moment I forgot how to breathe. My first instinct was simple: protect Emma. I hurried toward her, gently taking her small hand into mine before kneeling beside her. "Sweetheart," I whispered, forcing a calm smile I did not feel. "I think you are mistaken." She looked back at me with complete confidence, her blue eyes shining with innocent certainty. "No, Mommy, I am not." My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the footsteps approaching across the marble floor. Ethan Brooks had stopped walking. His security team instinctively paused several feet behind him, but he lifted one hand ever so slightly, signaling them to remain where they were. Nobody questioned the gesture. Nobody moved. That quiet authority explained why people followed him without hesitation. He studied Emma for several long seconds, not with suspicion or annoyance, but with genuine curiosity. Then his gaze shifted toward me. I had not seen those blue eyes in more than 6 years, yet they were exactly as I remembered. Calm, observant, impossible to hide anything from. I lowered my eyes first. It felt safer that way. One of the event coordinators cleared his throat awkwardly. Children do say the funniest things, he laughed, though nobody joined him. The staff quickly returned to arranging flowers and preparing tables, pretending the moment had already passed, but I could still feel whispers beginning behind polite smiles. Emma gently tugged on my sleeve. Did I say something wrong? She asked softly. I brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. I swallowed hard. But let us keep helping today, all right? She nodded immediately. She trusted me completely, and that trust made the secret I had carried for years feel heavier than ever. I turned to lead her toward the employee hallway, hoping we could quietly disappear before another question found us. We had barely taken 3 steps when a calm voice stopped us. Miss Foster. I froze. Slowly, I turned around. Ethan had crossed the distance between us alone. His security detail remained respectfully behind, giving him space while quietly observing the room. Up close, he looked older than the man I remembered, not because of wrinkles, but because life had settled quietly around his eyes. He carried himself with remarkable composure, yet something in his expression suggested Emma's words had unsettled him more than he wished anyone to know. He looked at Emma before speaking. Again, how old are you? She smiled politely. I turned 6 in April. Something almost invisible crossed his face. It vanished so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it. His attention drifted toward the small silver locket resting against Emma's sweater. I instinctively placed my hand over it before realizing what I had done. His eyes noticed the movement immediately. That is a beautiful necklace, he said gently. Emma touched it proudly. Mommy says it reminds me that I have always been loved. Ethan held her gaze for another quiet moment before looking back at me. I hope you and your daughter will remain until the gala begins, he said politely. There are a few questions I would like to ask later, if you are comfortable. Before I could answer, another member of his staff approached to remind him that the first guests had arrived. Ethan gave a brief nod and walked away, but not before glancing once more at the tiny silver locket that suddenly felt far more dangerous than any secret I had ever tried to hide. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, yet I felt Ethan's attention following us no matter where I worked. Every polished table, every arrangement of white roses, every tray of sparkling glasses became another excuse to keep my hands busy while my mind raced through questions I could not answer. Emma, on the other hand, behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She sat quietly in a corner of the family library with her coloring book, humming softly while drawing little cottages surrounded by flowers. Watching her always reminded me that children carried peace far more naturally than adults ever could. The library had once been my favorite room in the mansion. Tall walnut bookshelves stretched toward the ceiling, leather-bound books lined every wall, and late afternoon sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking perfectly trimmed gardens. I remembered standing there years ago with Ethan, talking about dreams that seemed so simple back then. He had once told me that no matter how complicated life became, this room always reminded him to slow down and think before making important decisions. I wondered if he still believed that. While dusting the highest shelf, my feather duster brushed against something hidden behind several old history books. A small wooden picture frame slipped forward. I reached for it instinctively, but it landed softly on the thick Persian rug before I could catch it. Kneeling to pick it up, I felt my heart stop. Inside the frame was a photograph taken beside a quiet lake during the first autumn Ethan and I spent together. We were younger then, smiling without fear, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath brilliant orange trees while the afternoon sun reflected across the water. I had believed every copy of that photograph had disappeared years ago. My fingers trembled against the edge of the frame as memories I had buried returned all at once. I always wondered whether someone would find that someday. His voice came quietly from the doorway behind me. I turned slowly. Ethan stood alone just inside the library, his suit jacket removed, the sleeves of his white dress shirt neatly rolled to his forearms. For the first time that day, he did not look like the powerful owner of an enormous estate. He looked like a man unexpectedly meeting his own past. I carefully stood, still holding the photograph. I did not mean to touch anything personal, I said softly. He stepped closer, his eyes resting on the picture before meeting mine. It stopped being personal the day you disappeared. His words were calm, yet they carried years of unanswered questions. I lowered my gaze. I never wanted to hurt you. He remained silent for several moments before speaking again. Then why did you leave without a single explanation? I opened my mouth, but no words came. Before I could gather the courage to answer, Emma skipped happily into the library carrying a small paper flower she had folded herself. Mommy, look what I made. She smiled brightly before noticing the photograph in my hands. Then she looked at Ethan and tilted her head with innocent curiosity. That is the same smile, she whispered. Ethan frowned gently. What do you mean? Emma pointed at the younger man in the picture. He smiles exactly like you do when you look at me. Ethan slowly turned his attention back toward the faded photograph. Tucked carefully inside the corner of the frame, almost invisible beneath the glass, rested a tiny pressed white daisy. His expression changed instantly. Very quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "You kept our promise after all." The tiny pressed daisy rested inside the corner of the photograph as though time itself had chosen to protect it. I stared at it without speaking because that fragile white flower carried a promise I had never expected anyone else to remember. 6 years earlier, Ethan had picked it from the edge of a quiet lakeside trail and laughed when I carefully placed it inside the photograph. Flowers fade, I had teased. He smiled and answered, "Then let this one remind us that some promises do not." Standing inside the library now, I realized neither of us had broken that promise willingly. We had simply believed different versions of the same lie. Emma looked back and forth between us with the quiet curiosity only children possessed. "What promise?" she asked. I forced a gentle smile. "Just an old memory, sweetheart." She accepted the answer without another question and wandered toward the large window, where she became fascinated by a pair of bluebirds resting on the stone fountain outside. Ethan stepped closer to the bookshelf, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "I searched for you," he said quietly. "For months." My throat tightened. "You should not have." He looked at me with calm sadness. I could not stop. His voice carried no anger, only the exhaustion of someone who had spent years asking questions that never found answers. "Your apartment was empty. Your phone had been disconnected. Your landlord said you left overnight." He paused before continuing. "Then I received your letter." I frowned in confusion. "My letter?" He nodded once. "It said you no longer wanted this life, that you wanted me to move on and never look for you again." Every word drained the warmth from the room. I slowly shook my head. "Ethan, I never wrote any letter." Silence settled between us so completely that I could hear the grandfather clock counting each passing second. He searched my face carefully, almost as though he hoped to find proof that I was mistaken. Instead, he found only disbelief. "Then someone wanted us apart," he whispered. My hands trembled around the photograph. Memories I had locked away for years returned with painful clarity. "The night before I disappeared," I said softly, "a woman came to my apartment. She introduced herself as someone close to your family. She told me your future had already been arranged. She said loving me would destroy everything you had worked for." Ethan remained perfectly still. "Did she say I sent her?" I looked down. "No. She said you were too honorable to ask me yourself." He closed his eyes briefly, and for the first time since I had known him, his composure slipped. "Claire," he said quietly, "if I had wanted you to leave, I would have told you myself." Before I could answer, Emma turned from the window holding something she had discovered on the reading table. It was an old leather-bound guest book. She opened it carefully, smiling as she admired the elegant handwriting inside. Then her smile faded. "Mommy," she asked innocently, "why is your name written here from before I was born?" Emma's innocent question settled over the library with a weight no child could possibly understand. I looked at the faded guest book resting in her small hands and immediately recognized my own handwriting from years ago. Every signature marked another afternoon I had spent inside this mansion when it had once felt less like an impossible dream and more like a place where I belonged. I walked toward her slowly and gently closed the book before she could ask another question. "Because Mommy used to work here a long time ago," I answered softly. It was not a lie, but it was only a small piece of the truth. Emma accepted the explanation with a thoughtful nod before wandering back toward the window, once again distracted by the birds dancing around the stone fountain outside. Ethan remained silent until he was certain she could no longer hear us. "You were never just an employee to me," he said quietly. His words were calm, yet every syllable carried years of memories neither of us had escaped. I lowered my eyes, unable to meet his gaze. "None of that matters anymore. It matters to me." I could hear the sincerity in his voice, and that frightened me more than anger ever could. "Claire, if you never wrote that letter, then everything I believed for 6 years was built on someone else's decision." I closed my eyes for a brief moment before finally allowing myself to speak the truth I had buried for so long. "The woman who visited me told me you had accepted an engagement that would protect your family's future. She said I would only become an obstacle standing between you and everything you had worked to build. She knew details about your life that nobody outside your family should have known. I believed her because I thought love sometimes meant stepping aside." Ethan slowly shook his head. "I never accepted any engagement. There was never anyone else." His answer landed with quiet certainty, leaving no room for doubt. Tears blurred my vision as years of regret suddenly felt heavier than ever. "After I left New York, I found out I was pregnant." The words escaped almost as a whisper, but once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. Ethan stared at me without moving. His expression remained composed, yet I watched every trace of color slowly disappear from his face. "I wanted to tell you," I continued, struggling to keep my voice steady. "More times than I can count. I wrote letters. I stood outside payphones. I even bought a bus ticket back to the city once. But every time I imagined your life moving forward without me, I convinced myself Emma deserved peace more than uncertainty." Ethan turned toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his shoulders rising with one slow breath before he finally spoke again. "You carried that burden alone for 6 years." I nodded silently. He looked back at me, and for the first time I saw unmistakable heartbreak in the eyes of a man who had spent his entire adult life hiding every emotion behind quiet control. Before either of us could say another word, Emma skipped back across the library carrying a crayon drawing she had just finished. She smiled proudly and placed it on the table between us. 3 stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun, holding hands with smiles stretched across every face. Above them, written carefully in uneven 6-year-old handwriting, were 5 simple words that made Ethan's breathing catch. "Someday I will meet Dad." The crayon drawing remained on the polished library table long after Emma skipped back toward the window, completely unaware that 5 simple words had just changed the direction of 3 lives. I stared at the uneven handwriting until the letters blurred together. "Someday I will meet Dad." She had written those words with hope, not sadness. She had never complained about the empty space in her life. She had simply believed that one day it would no longer be empty. Ethan reached toward the drawing with remarkable care, lifting the paper as though it were more valuable than every painting hanging throughout the estate. His eyes lingered on the smiling stick figures before he quietly looked at me. "She has been waiting for someone she has never even known," he said. I nodded slowly. "I never wanted her to grow up feeling abandoned." He swallowed before asking the question I had expected for 6 long years. "Does she know anything about her father?" I smiled faintly despite the ache in my chest. Only the things I knew were true. His expression softened. "What did you tell her?" I looked toward Emma, who was now watching butterflies drift across the gardens beyond the tall windows. I told her that her father was patient, that he always held doors open for strangers, that he believed kindness was a strength, not a weakness. I told her he loved reading on rainy afternoons, and that he once rescued an injured bird because he could not bear to leave it alone. A quiet laugh escaped him, almost surprised by its own existence. "I remember that bird," he whispered. "It refused to fly away for 2 days." I smiled for the first time that afternoon. Emma loved that story. Silence settled comfortably between us, no longer filled with accusation, but with memories that had somehow survived the passing years. Ethan carefully placed the drawing back onto the table before speaking again. "Claire, there is something I need you to know." I looked at him without saying a word. "If I had known you were carrying our daughter, there is nothing that could have kept me away. Not my family, not my business, not a single expectation placed upon me. I would have chosen both of you every time." His voice never rose above a gentle conversation, yet every word reached places inside my heart I had spent years trying to protect. Tears gathered in my eyes before I could stop them. "I know that now," I whispered. I just did not know it then. At that exact moment, a discreet knock interrupted the silence. Ethan's longtime executive assistant stepped into the library carrying a small archival storage box wrapped in protective paper. "Sir," he said respectfully, "our records manager found this after you requested every personal document from 6 years ago." Ethan accepted the box with quiet curiosity. Inside lay several neatly preserved folders tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Resting on top was a sealed cream-colored envelope that had never been opened. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting I recognized instantly, were 7 words that caused my heart to stop all over again. For Ethan Brooks. Deliver only if she leaves forever. The sealed envelope rested between us like a voice from another lifetime. I recognized the handwriting before Ethan even touched it. Every elegant curve of every letter belonged to his aunt, the woman who had smiled kindly at me while quietly changing the course of our lives. Ethan carefully broke the aging seal without saying a word. The paper inside had yellowed with time, but the ink remained perfectly clear. His eyes moved slowly across the page. I watched the calm confidence that had defined him all afternoon quietly disappear, replaced by a silence that seemed far heavier than any anger. After several long seconds, he handed the letter to me. My hands trembled as I began reading. The words were painfully simple. She admitted that she had come to my apartment without Ethan's knowledge. She confessed that she believed I would eventually become a burden to the future she had planned for him, and she feared that love would distract him from the responsibilities his family expected him to carry. She wrote that she had arranged for the false letter, knowing Ethan would never question her intentions. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence stood alone. "If there is anyone who deserves forgiveness, it is not me. It is the 2 people whose lives I separated." I lowered the letter, unable to find my voice. The library suddenly felt much smaller than before. Ethan stood beside the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his back turned toward me as evening sunlight slowly faded into the soft glow of the estate lights outside. "She passed away 3 years ago," he said quietly. I never knew she carried this secret until today. There was no bitterness in his voice, only sadness. The kind that comes from discovering the greatest mistake of your life was never truly yours. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. "For 6 years," I whispered, "I believed leaving was the only way to protect you." Ethan slowly turned toward me. "And for 6 years I believed you had stopped loving me." Neither of us had chosen that story, yet we had both lived inside it. Before either of us could continue, Emma wandered back into the library carrying a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade she had proudly insisted on helping prepare. She carefully placed 1 glass in front of Ethan before smiling brightly. "You looked thirsty." He accepted the glass with a grateful smile that reached his eyes for the first time that day. "Thank you." Emma climbed onto one of the leather chairs beside him and studied his face with quiet concentration. "You smile differently now," she observed. Ethan laughed softly. "Is that a good thing?" She nodded immediately. "Your eyes look happy now." He looked at her for a long moment before gently asking, "Emma, can I ask you something?" She smiled. "Of course." He hesitated, choosing every word with extraordinary care. "Why did you say I was your father when you first saw me today?" Emma looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because when I looked at you, it felt like I already knew you." She touched the little silver locket around her neck. "And because every time Mommy told me stories about my daddy, I imagined someone whose eyes smiled exactly like yours." Ethan quietly lowered his head, overwhelmed by the innocence of her answer. In that moment, I realized the truth had finally brought us back together. But whether we could become the family Emma had imagined for so many years was a choice that still waited just beyond the library doors. The quiet question Emma asked lingered in the library long after the words themselves had faded. She had not been searching for proof. She had only been listening to her heart in the uncomplicated way children often did. Ethan remained seated beside her for a long moment, saying nothing at all. Then he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small silver key attached to a worn leather keychain. He smiled faintly as he turned it between his fingers. "I have carried this every day for almost 7 years, he admitted. I looked at the tiny key with quiet curiosity. "What does it open?" He glanced toward the far corner of the library where an old walnut cabinet stood beneath a landscape painting. "Something I never had the courage to throw away." He crossed the room and unlocked the cabinet. Inside rested a simple cedar box that looked untouched by time. There were no stacks of money, no business documents, no symbols of power. Instead, the box contained movie ticket stubs, pressed flowers, handwritten notes, postcards from weekend trips, and a faded coffee shop receipt with 2 hot chocolates listed at the bottom. Emma stepped closer, fascinated by the small treasures. "Are these yours?" she asked. Ethan nodded gently. "They belong to someone who changed my life." Emma picked up one of the postcards and studied the lake printed on the front. "Did Mommy go there with you?" she asked. I smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart. A long time ago." Ethan carefully lifted a tiny paper crane from the box. "Claire folded this while we were waiting for our coffee one snowy afternoon," he said. She laughed because I could never learn how to make one. Emma giggled. "I can teach you." The offer was so innocent that both of us laughed together without thinking. It was the first genuine laughter we had shared in years, and somehow it made the library feel warmer than before. Ethan looked at Emma with unmistakable affection. "I would like that very much." She reached into her own pocket and removed a slightly wrinkled paper butterfly she had folded that morning while waiting for me to finish cleaning. Without hesitation, she placed it inside the cedar box beside the old paper crane. "Now it has something new," she said proudly. Ethan looked down at the butterfly, then back at Emma. "Thank you." His voice carried quiet emotion that words could barely contain. I watched him close the box again with extraordinary care. For the first time, the keepsakes inside no longer represented only what he had lost. They also represented what might still be possible. Outside the library, elegant music drifted through the mansion as guests continued arriving for the charity gala. The evening carried on exactly as planned, yet inside that quiet room time seemed to belong only to the 3 of us. Emma slipped her small hand into Ethan's without hesitation. "Will you come see the rose garden with me?" she asked. He looked toward me first, silently asking permission without speaking a single word. I gave a gentle nod. Together we stepped through the open French doors into the warm evening air where white roses glowed beneath delicate garden lights. Emma walked happily between us, still holding both of our hands. Looking at her peaceful smile, I realized she had never needed wealth, grand promises, or perfect explanations. She had only needed the 2 people she loved to stop walking in opposite directions. As we reached the center of the garden, Emma looked up at Ethan with quiet hope shining in her blue eyes, and I sensed that the next words she chose would change every tomorrow that waited for us. The evening breeze carried the fragrance of white roses through the gardens as tiny lights shimmered above the stone pathways like distant stars. Beyond the hedges, guests continued enjoying the charity gala, their conversations blending softly with the music drifting from the ballroom. Yet none of those elegant celebrations mattered to me anymore. My entire world had narrowed to one quiet path, where Emma walked between Ethan and me, happily swinging our hands as though this had always been the way our family looked. She suddenly stopped beneath an old oak tree wrapped in delicate white lights and looked up at Ethan with thoughtful blue eyes. "Can I ask you one more question?" she said. Ethan smiled gently. "You can ask me anything." Emma studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "If you really wanted to find us all these years, does that mean you never stopped loving Mommy?" The question caught both of us completely unprepared. Ethan looked at me before answering, his expression calm but completely honest. "No," he said quietly. "I never stopped." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of 6 lost years. Emma smiled as though she had expected that answer all along. Then she turned toward me. "Mommy, do you still love him?" I laughed softly through unexpected tears. Children had a remarkable way of walking directly toward truths adults spent years avoiding. I looked into Ethan's eyes and realized I was no longer afraid of the answer. "Some feelings do not disappear," I admitted. "They simply wait until the truth catches up with them." Emma's smile grew even brighter. She reached for both of our hands again and carefully placed them together before wrapping her own small fingers around them. "Then nobody has to be lonely anymore." Ethan slowly knelt until he was at her eye level. His voice became almost a whisper. "Emma, there is something I would like to ask you too." She nodded eagerly. "What is it?" He smiled with quiet hope. "Would it be all right if I spent time getting to know you? I missed many important moments, and I cannot change the past, but I would like the chance to be part of your future." Emma did not answer immediately. Instead, She stepped forward and wrapped her little arms around his neck with complete trust. I was hoping you would ask. Ethan closed his eyes as he gently returned the embrace. I watched silent tears slip down his face, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally holding the daughter he had never known existed. After a long moment, Emma leaned back just enough to look at him. "Can I call you Dad now?" she asked. Softly. Ethan's breath caught before he answered. "If that is what your heart wants." She grinned with the brightest smile I had ever seen. "Hi, Dad." Those two words seemed to quiet the entire world around us. Ethan smiled through tears that he no longer tried to hide. And for the first time since I had known him, I saw a man who no longer carried the burden of power alone. He carried love instead. He stood, gently taking my hand once more. "Claire," he said, "I cannot ask for yesterday back, but I will spend every tomorrow proving that neither of you will ever walk alone again." I believed him because I no longer saw the powerful man the world feared. I saw the patient man who had preserved old photographs, forgotten flowers, and impossible hope for 6 long years. As we walked together beneath the glowing garden lights, Emma laughing between us, I finally understood that destiny does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with the quiet voice of a little girl who simply recognizes her father before anyone else does, reminding us that love can be delayed by lies, but it can never truly be erased by time.